The dusty crate fell from Beatrice Gardner's hands, scattering leather-bound volumes across the wooden floor of the only library in Gunnison, Colorado. And she knew in that moment of 1883 summer heat that leaving this place would hurt far more than she'd admitted to herself. The books sprawled open like wounded birds, their pages fluttering in the breeze that swept through the open windows, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant mountains. She'd been packing for 3 days now, methodically wrapping each volume in brown paper, sealing away not just stories but the dreams she'd carried west 2 years ago, when she'd arrived as a young woman of 21 with nothing but hope and a trunk full of books. The decision to leave hadn't been easy. The town council had made it clear that funding for the library was being redirected to more practical ventures, a new saloon and a larger general store. Education, they'd said with apologetic shrugs, didn't put food on tables or money in pockets. Beatrice had argued until her voice went hoarse, had presented careful records showing how many children now read at advanced levels, how many minors spent their evenings improving their minds rather than drinking away their wages. But numbers and passion couldn't compete with commerce, and the building that housed her beloved collection had been sold to a cattle broker from Denver. She bent to gather the fallen books, her fingers trembling as she touched the worn cover of a poetry collection. This one had been read so many times the spine was cracked in 3 places. Old Mr. Henderson had checked it out every month without fail, memorizing verses to recite to his wife's grave. The thought of these books scattered to the winds, of the children who'd gathered for story hour every Saturday morning, left without their weekly escape into worlds beyond the harsh realities of frontier life, made her chest ache with a grief that felt physical. "You need help with that." The voice came from the doorway, deep and rough-edged like gravel underfoot. Beatrice looked up, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. The man standing in the entrance was tall and broad-shouldered, his frame silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. He wore dusty trail clothes and a hat that had seen better days, and even from across the room she could see the weariness in his stance, the kind that came from hard riding and harder living. "I'm managing, thank you," she said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. The kindness of strangers felt dangerous right now, like it might crack the careful composure she'd maintained through this whole ordeal. He stepped inside anyway, removing his hat to reveal sandy hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been much older than her own 23 years, but his eyes held the kind of experience that added decades. "Name's Isaac Thompson. Just rode in from a cattle drive up north. Heard the library was closing. Seems a shame." A shame doesn't begin to cover it. Beatrice clutched the books to her chest, suddenly aware of how empty the shelves behind her had become. But the world doesn't run on what should be. It runs on what people with money decide is important. Isaac crossed the room with an easy stride, bending to help gather the remaining books despite her protests. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his hands, though calloused and scarred, handled the volumes with surprising gentleness. "My mama taught me to read from a book just like this," he said, holding up a primer. "Said education was the only thing nobody could take from you once you had it. Your mother was a wise woman." Beatrice took the book from him, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, and she pulled away quickly, unsettled by her own reaction. "She passed when I was 14. Fever took her one winter." Isaac's voice was matter-of-fact, but something flickered in his expression, a old pain carefully contained. "Never got to thank her proper for pushing me to learn. Most cowboys can barely write their own names, but I can read everything from Shakespeare to land deeds. Saved me more than once." They worked in silence for a few minutes, creating neat stacks of rescued books. Beatrice found herself acutely aware of his presence, the way he moved with a deliberate care that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. Cowboys were a common sight in Gunnison, men passing through on their way to somewhere else, faces that blurred together in memory. But something about Isaac Thompson felt different, like he occupied space more fully than others, like the air around him held more weight. "Where will you go?" he asked, setting the last book on the growing pile. "When you leave, I mean." The question she'd been avoiding for weeks. "Denver, probably. Or maybe back east to Boston. I have an aunt there who's been writing, saying there are teaching positions available, places where people actually value education. You have people here who value it." Isaac gestured toward the window, where the main street of Gunnison stretched out in both directions. "Those kids who come to your story hours, the miners who have been learning to write letters home, old Henderson who can recite poetry now. They value it." Valuing something and fighting for it are different things. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. When the council voted, not one person stood up to argue for keeping this place open. Not one. Maybe they didn't know how. Isaac turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Not everyone's got the words for what they feel. Doesn't make the feeling less real." Before Beatrice could respond, the sound of hoofbeats and raised voices drew their attention to the window. A group of riders thundered past, kicking up dust and shouting. She recognized some of them, ranch hands from the big spreads outside town, young men with too much energy and not enough sense. They'd been trouble lately, drinking and fighting, making the streets unsafe after dark. Isaac's expression hardened. "They've been causing problems. The sheriff handles it," Beatrice said, though they both knew that Sheriff Dalton, pushing 70 and half blind, handled very little these days. Mostly they just make noise. Noise can turn into something worse. Isaac settled his hat back on his head. "I should let you get back to your packing. Just wanted to stop in, see the library before it was gone. Meant something to me, knowing a place like this existed out here." He moved toward the door, and Beatrice felt an unexpected panic at his departure. "Wait," she called out, then fumbled for a reason to stop him. "If you really want to help, I could use someone to move these crates to the storage room at the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson said I could keep them there until I arrange transport." The smile that crossed Isaac's face transformed it entirely, chasing away the weariness and revealing something warmer underneath. "Would be my pleasure, Miss Gardner. How did you know my name?" She hadn't introduced herself. Small town. People talk. He picked up 2 of the heavy crates with ease. "Also, Mrs. Patterson mentioned you when I took a room at her boarding house this morning. Said you were the smartest woman in Colorado and it was a crying shame what the council did." Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mrs. Patterson is prone to exaggeration." "I don't think so." Isaac headed for the door, his voice floating back over his shoulder. "Not about this." They spent the next 2 hours hauling crates through the dusty streets of Gunnison. The August sun beat down mercilessly, and Beatrice's dress grew damp with perspiration, her arms aching from the weight of her precious cargo. Isaac worked without complaint, his strength making quick work of loads that would have taken her multiple trips. People stopped to watch them pass, some offering sympathetic looks, others shaking their heads at the waste of a perfectly good Saturday afternoon. At the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson met them with lemonade and a knowing look that made Beatrice want to sink through the floorboards. The older woman had been trying to matchmake ever since Beatrice arrived in Gunnison, parading every eligible bachelor through the parlor with transparent intent. That Isaac was now helping with such an intimate task, the dismantling of Beatrice's life here, would fuel weeks of speculation. "You're a godsend, Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Patterson declared, pressing a cold glass into his hands. "Our Beatrice here is too proud to ask for help, tries to carry the whole world on those slim shoulders." "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs," Beatrice protested, but the words came out weaker than intended. The exhaustion of the past weeks was catching up with her, the emotional toll of saying goodbye to a dream. Capable isn't the same as having to do it alone. Isaac drained his lemonade in long swallows, then set the glass down with a nod of thanks. "I've got a few more hours before dark. What else needs moving?" They fell into a rhythm, a silent partnership that felt natural despite having just met. Isaac seemed to anticipate what she needed, moving the heavier items without being asked, organizing the storage room so everything fit efficiently. Beatrice found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, noticing small details. The way he favored his left side slightly, as if nursing an old injury. The careful way he stacked the crates, making sure weight was distributed evenly. The gentleness with which he handled a box marked fragile that contained her personal collection of first editions. By the time they finished, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold over the mountains. They stood on the boarding house porch, both dusty and tired, and Beatrice realized she didn't want him to leave. The thought was alarming in its intensity. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than the simple words could convey. "You didn't have to spend your day helping a stranger. Didn't feel like helping a stranger." Isaac looked out at the darkening street, at the lights beginning to glow in windows up and down the row of buildings. "Felt like doing something that mattered. Books matter to you. It wasn't a question. Books saved me." He turned back to face her, and in the fading light his eyes looked almost gray, like storm clouds gathering. "After my mama died, my father took to drinking, got mean with it. I spent a lot of nights hiding in the barn with a lantern, and whatever book I could sneak from the house. The stories took me away from the sound of him destroying everything inside, gave me somewhere else to be until morning." The raw honesty of the confession struck Beatrice silent. She'd grown up in comfort, in a Philadelphia home filled with books and education and safety. The idea of reading as survival rather than pleasure had never occurred to her. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "No child should have to escape their own home. We all have our scars." Isaac shifted his weight, and she saw him wince slightly. The physical ones heal easier than the others, but you learn to carry them both. Before she could ask what he meant, Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway with her determined smile. "Mr. Thompson, you simply must stay for supper." "I won't take no for an answer. Any man who works that hard deserves a decent meal." Isaac glanced at Beatrice, a question in his look. She found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to, wanting more time with this unexpected presence in her disrupted life. Dinner was a lively affair. Mrs. Patterson had 5 other boarders, all of whom had opinions about the library closing and questions for Isaac about his cattle driving experiences. He answered with an easy humor that surprised Beatrice, telling stories about life on the trail that had even Mr. Jameson, the dour bank clerk, laughing into his soup. But it was the quieter moments Beatrice noticed most. The way Isaac's gaze kept finding hers across the table. How he listened when she talked about her favorite books with an attention that felt like a physical touch. The careful way he avoided mentioning her impending departure, as if speaking it aloud would make it more real. After dinner, they ended up on the porch swing while the others retired inside. The night air had cooled considerably, and Beatrice wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Crickets sang in the darkness, and somewhere down the street a piano played a melancholy tune. "Tell me about Boston," Isaac said. "What's drawing you back east? Safety? Security?" A place where I can teach without worrying about funding or town councils changing their minds. Beatrice kicked gently, setting the swing in motion. Everything that's missing here, but not what you love. He said it with certainty. She turned to look at him. How do you know what I love? Saw it in your face today when you were packing those books. You weren't handling property, you were saying goodbye to friends. And the way you talked about the children in your story hours, the minors learning to write. That's love, pure and simple. Isaac's voice dropped lower. Question is whether safety is worth giving up the thing that makes you come alive. Easy to say when you're not the one losing everything you've built. The words came out sharper than intended, a defense against how accurately he'd struck at the truth. You're right. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment and the swing creaked as it moved. Can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone, Beatrice nodded, feeling the weight of what was coming. I had a younger sister, Hannah. She was 8 when the scarlet fever came through our county. My father was too drunk to ride for the doctor, and I was too young to go alone at night. I sat up with her, reading every story I knew, making some up when the books ran out. She died just before dawn, holding my hand. His voice remained steady, but Beatrice could hear the old anguish beneath the words. I've spent the last 9 years riding from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to feel settled. Telling myself I was chasing work, adventure, freedom. But really I was running from the guilt. It wasn't your fault. Beatrice reached out instinctively, covering his hand with hers. You were a child yourself. Head knows that, heart slower to learn. Isaac turned his palm up, lacing his fingers through hers. The gesture felt natural, right, like their hands had been designed to fit together this way. But here's what I learned, riding all those years. Running doesn't actually take you anywhere. It just keeps you moving so you don't have to feel how lost you are. And when you find something that feels like home, even if it's scary, even if it might not last, you have to be brave enough to stay and fight for it. The implication in his words hung between them. Was he talking about himself or about her? Beatrice's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. They'd known each other for less than a day, but something about Isaac Thompson had slipped past all her careful defenses, had found the lonely places she'd hidden even from herself. I'm not running, she said, but the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. Aren't you? He shifted closer, and she could feel the warmth of him despite the cool night air. I think you came west looking for something and you found it in that library. You built something beautiful, gave people a gift they didn't even know they needed. And when it got hard, when the fight started to cost you something, you decided it was easier to pack up and call it someone else's problem. Anger flared hot in her chest. You have no right to judge me. You don't know anything about what I've been through, the battles I've fought. I went to every council meeting for 6 months, wrote letters, organized petitions. I fought until there was nothing left to fight with. Did you? Isaac's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. Or did you fight until it got uncomfortable, until it meant risking real rejection, real failure? Because from where I'm sitting, you gave up the moment the council voted against you. Didn't even wait to see if the town might rally to save the place on their own. They won't. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Had she assumed too much, moved too quickly to protect herself from further disappointment? Maybe not. But you didn't give them the chance to try. Isaac stood, and immediately she missed the warmth of him beside her. I should go. I've said too much, and you've got packing to finish. Beatrice watched him descend the porch steps, his figure disappearing into the darkness beyond the street lamps. Her hand still tingled where he'd held it, and her mind churned with his words. The worst part was how much truth they carried. She had given up. Not on the library, maybe, but on Gunnison itself. On the idea that this rough frontier town could ever really be home, sleep didn't come easily that night. She lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the day. Isaac's words haunted her, not because they were cruel but because they were accurate. She'd been so focused on the betrayal of the council's decision that she hadn't stopped to consider alternatives, hadn't thought beyond her own hurt feelings. But what could she do now? The building was sold, the funds redirected. The library as it existed was finished. Unless she could buy the building herself, which was impossible on a librarian's wages, or convince the cattle broker to change his mind, which seemed equally unlikely. The practical part of her brain that had always served her well said the situation was hopeless, that Isaac's romantic notions about fighting and staying were just that, romantic notions without basis in reality. Yet another part of her, a part she'd been carefully ignoring, whispered that maybe reality wasn't as fixed as she'd believed. That maybe there were possibilities she hadn't considered because she'd been too busy planning her escape to look for them. Morning came too early, bringing with it the harsh light of practical concerns. Beatrice had promised to have the library completely cleared by the end of the week, which gave her 4 more days to pack up 2 years of careful organization. She dressed quickly and headed to the library, determined to work without distraction. Isaac was waiting on the front steps. He stood as she approached, hat in hand, looking uncertain in a way he hadn't the day before. "I owe you an apology. Last night I spoke out of turn, said things that were none of my business. You've got every right to make whatever decision you think is best for your life." Beatrice unlocked the door, trying to ignore how her heart had leapt at the sight of him. "You weren't entirely wrong. I have been running, in a way, but knowing that doesn't change the facts of the situation. Maybe we could change the facts." Isaac followed her inside, and she noticed he carried a leather satchel. "I spent half the night thinking about it, and I might have an idea. Probably a crazy one, but hear me out." She turned to face him, arms crossed. "I'm listening. What if the library didn't need the building? What if you could take it to the people instead?" He pulled papers from his satchel, spreading them on the circulation desk. "Look, I drew up some rough plans. A wagon, reinforced and weatherproofed, fitted with shelves. You could travel to the mining camps, the ranches, anywhere people need books but can't get to town regular. Charge a small membership fee to cover costs, maybe get donations from people who believe in the cause." Beatrice stared at the sketches. They were surprisingly detailed, showing a modified freight wagon with custom shelving, a small desk area, even a canvas awning for outdoor reading sessions. The idea was audacious, impractical, and utterly unlike anything she'd considered. "A traveling library," she said slowly. "I've read about them in the East, but nothing like this. Not out here." "Why not? People need stories whether they're in Boston or the Colorado Territory." "Maybe more so out here, where life is harder and escapes are fewer." Isaac's enthusiasm was contagious, his eyes bright with possibility. "You said yourself that the miners improved when they had access to books. The ranch families, the homesteaders, they're all hungry for education but too isolated to get it. You could bring it to them. It would be expensive, building a wagon like this, maintaining it, traveling constantly." But even as she listed the obstacles, her mind was racing ahead, seeing possibilities. "And dangerous traveling alone. You wouldn't be alone." Isaac met her gaze steadily. "I'm good with horses, know the territory, can handle repairs and navigation. I could drive the wagon, handle the practical side while you manage the books and the teaching. We barely know each other." The protest sounded feeble even to her ears. "True, but we could learn. And I'll be honest with you, Miss Gardner, I'm tired of drifting. I watched you yesterday, saw the way you loved what you do, and I realized I've never had that. Never found the thing that makes me want to plant roots and fight to stay. Maybe this could be it. Maybe helping you bring books to people who need them could be the purpose I've been looking for." Beatrice walked to the window, looking out at the street where she'd spent 2 years building a life. The idea terrified her. It was risky, uncertain, required trusting a man she'd just met. But it also thrilled her in a way nothing had since she'd first arrived in Gunnison, full of dreams and determination. "I'd need to see numbers," she said, still facing the window. "Real costs, potential income, a practical business plan. And we'd need to establish clear boundaries, professional arrangements. This would be a business partnership, nothing more." She heard him move closer, felt him standing just behind her. "Whatever you need. I'll work up detailed plans, get estimates from the carpenter and wheelwright. We can draw up a contract if it makes you feel safer." Beatrice turned and found herself closer to him than she'd realized. This close, she could see flecks of green in his gray eyes, could smell leather and sage and something uniquely him. "Why are you doing this? Really?" "Because yesterday, for the first time in 9 years, I felt useful. I felt like I was building something instead of just passing through." His voice dropped lower, intimate. "And because when I saw you holding those books, saying goodbye to your dream, I recognized that look. I've seen it in my own mirror too many times. I couldn't walk away knowing I might have been able to help. And if I say yes, if we do this and it fails, we'd both lose everything we invest. Then we'd fail together, which is better than succeeding alone." Isaac smiled, and it transformed his whole face again, made him look younger and more hopeful. "But I don't think we'd fail. I think we'd be remarkable." The certainty in his voice decided her. "All right, let's see these detailed plans of yours. And I want to talk to people, see if there's really demand for this kind of service. If the numbers work and people are interested, then maybe, just maybe, this crazy idea could work." Isaac's whoop of joy echoed through the empty library, and before Beatrice quite knew what was happening, he'd picked her up and spun her around. She found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time since the council had delivered their verdict. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools, the air between them charged with possibility and something else, something neither of them was quite ready to name yet. They spent the next 3 days in a flurry of activity. Isaac proved as good as his word, returning with detailed cost estimates from local craftsmen. The carpenter, Mr. Wu, got excited about the project and offered to reduce his fee in exchange for advertising his services in the communities they visited. The wheelwright, a gruff man named Peterson, contributed extra reinforcement at cost when he heard what the wagon would be used for. Beatrice, meanwhile, visited every mining camp within a day's ride, talking to families about whether they'd pay for access to books and educational materials. The response overwhelmed her. Mothers wept at the thought of their children having regular access to primers and readers. Miners pooled money on the spot for membership fees. One old prospector, barely literate himself, pressed a gold nugget into her palm and begged her to teach his grandson to read. By the 3rd evening, they met at the boarding house to compile their findings. Mrs. Patterson had given them use of the parlor, though she kept finding transparent excuses to pass through, clearly delighted by this development. "Look at these numbers," Beatrice said, spreading her notes across the table. "I have commitments for over 60 memberships already, and I haven't even reached the ranches to the south. At $2 per family per month, that's enough to cover operating costs with surplus for expanding the collection." Isaac laid out the construction estimates. "Mr. Wu can have the wagon ready in 2 weeks. Peterson guarantees the wheels for 5 years of hard travel." I've been talking to some of the ranch owners about letting us stable our horses in exchange for priority service. Everyone wants this to work. I can't believe this is really happening. Beatrice felt dizzy with the speed of it all. 4 days ago, she'd been packing to leave. Now she was planning a future more ambitious than anything she dared imagine. Believe it. Isaac reached across the table, covering her hand with his. The gesture had become familiar over the past days, a casual intimacy that felt both comfortable and electric. We're going to make this work, Beatrice. You and me together. The use of her first name sent a flutter through her stomach. When had they crossed from formal address to given names? She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but it felt right, natural. Isaac. She turned her hand over, lacing their fingers together. What happens when this is real? When we're spending every day together, traveling alone, dependent on each other? How do we keep this professional? His thumb traced circles on her palm, the touch sending shivers up her arm. Do you want to keep it professional? The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Beatrice knew she should say yes, should maintain proper boundaries. She was a respectable woman, a teacher and librarian. Getting involved romantically with her business partner was foolish at best, disastrous at worst. But she'd been respectable her whole life, had followed every rule, met every expectation. And where had it gotten her? Alone, heartbroken, nearly driven from the place she loved. I don't know what I want, she admitted. This is all happening so fast. A week ago, I didn't know you existed. Now I'm planning to travel the territory with you, trust my whole future to a partnership with someone who's essentially a stranger. Then let's not be strangers. Isaac stood, pulling her gently to her feet. Ask me anything. I'll tell you the truth, no matter what. Beatrice's mind raced with questions. Why cattle driving? Why spend years moving instead of settling? Because settling meant dealing with my father, meant facing the place where Hannah died. Easier to keep moving, tell myself I was free when really I was just running. His hands held hers firmly, grounding. Next question. Have you ever been in love? The question escaped before she could stop it. Too personal, too revealing. Once. Girl named Sarah in a town in Kansas. I was 19, thought I'd found the one. Then she found out about my father, about Hannah, about all the broken pieces I carry around. Decided she wanted someone simpler, someone without so much history. Pain flickered across his face, old but not forgotten. Taught me that honesty costs, but lying costs more. I'm sorry. Beatrice squeezed his hands. She was a fool to let you go. Maybe I wasn't ready to be kept. Isaac smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Your turn. Why books? Why travel west to teach in a place like Gunnison? Because back east I was suffocating. My parents had my whole life planned. Marry well, have children, host dinner parties, and never think beyond the walls of my own comfortable prison. But I wanted more. I wanted to matter, to make a difference. When I read about territories needing teachers and librarians, it felt like escape and purpose rolled into one. Are you running too? The question was gentle, curious rather than accusatory. Maybe I was, but I don't want to run anymore. She met his gaze steadily. I want to build something here, something that matters. With you, if you'll have me, as a partner in every sense. The air between them shifted, charged with a current that had been building since that first day. Isaac lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheek with devastating gentleness. Beatrice, he breathed, and then he was kissing her. The world narrowed to the press of his lips, the warmth of his hands, the taste of possibility and promise. Beatrice melted into him, her arms sliding around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, a question being asked and answered. Then it deepened, became something more urgent, more desperate, as if they were both trying to make up for every lonely moment that had led them to this point. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "So much for keeping things professional." Beatrice laughed, the sound breathless and giddy. "We can still be professional, just professionally in love." "I like the sound of that." He kissed her again, softer this time, sweeter. "Professionally in love with Beatrice Gardner, librarian and the bravest woman I've ever met." "I'm not brave. I'm terrified." But she was smiling, felt light and free in a way she'd never experienced. Brave doesn't mean not scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway. Isaac pulled her close, tucking her head under his chin. "We'll be scared together, and that'll make us both braver." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, until Mrs. Patterson's deliberate coughing from the doorway broke the spell. The landlady wore a smile so wide it threatened to split her face. "I hate to interrupt, but there are people here to see you, Beatrice dear." "Rather a lot of people, actually." Confused, Beatrice followed Mrs. Patterson to the front door, her breath caught at the sight. The entire street was filled with people. Miners still dusty from their shifts, ranch families who'd ridden hours to town, shopkeepers and teachers and children. They held lanterns against the gathering dusk, creating a river of light that stretched as far as she could see. Old Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his hat clutched in weathered hands. "Miss Gardner, we heard about your plan, about the traveling library. We wanted you to know that you're not alone in this. We should have fought for the library before, should have stood up at those council meetings. We didn't, and that's on us. But we're fighting now." A woman Beatrice recognized from the mining camp pushed forward, a little girl clinging to her skirts. "My Lucy learned to read from you, Miss Gardner. First girl in our family who can write her own name. That's worth fighting for." One by one, people stepped forward with stories. Lives changed by books, children educated, families brought together by shared reading. They pressed money into her hands, membership fees and donations, far more than she and Isaac had projected. They offered labor, materials, services. The blacksmith pledged free repairs for the wagon. The general store owner promised supplies at cost. A rancher offered horses from his personal stock, the best travelers he had. Beatrice found herself crying, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Isaac stood beside her, his hand firm on her back, steadying her through the storm of emotion. When the last person had spoken, when the pledges and promises had been recorded, Sheriff Dalton shuffled forward. Despite his age and infirmity, his voice carried clear in the night air. "I've been sheriff of this town for 30 years, seen it grow from nothing to what it is now. But I've never been prouder of Gunnison than I am tonight." He looked directly at Beatrice. "You gave up on us a little too quick, young lady, but we gave you reason to. This time, we'll do better. This town will support your library wherever it goes, however it needs to travel. You have my word on that." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Beatrice felt Isaac's arm slide around her waist, anchoring her as her knees threatened to buckle. This was what community meant, what home felt like. Not a building or a place, but people choosing to stand together to fight for what mattered. Later, after the crowd had dispersed and the pledges had been tallied, Beatrice and Isaac sat on the boarding house steps, still dazed by the evening's events. "We did it," she whispered. "We're really going to do this. We really are." Isaac pulled her close and she rested her head on his shoulder. Scared, terrified, excited, grateful. She turned to look at him, this man who'd walked into her life and turned everything upside down in the best possible way. "A week ago I thought my life was over. Now it feels like it's just beginning, for both of us." He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. "I spent 9 years looking for somewhere to belong. Turns out belonging isn't about a place. It's about finding someone who sees you, really sees you, and chooses to stay anyway. I see you, Isaac Thompson, all your broken pieces and brave heart, and I choose you today and every day going forward. That sounds suspiciously like a proposal, Miss Gardner. Beatrice pulled back to look at him properly. Would that be completely insane? We've known each other a week, probably. Isaac grinned. But we're starting a traveling library in the Colorado Territory. Insane seems to be our specialty. Then yes, I'm proposing. Or agreeing to your proposal, however this works. She was laughing now, giddy with the impossibility of it all. Isaac Thompson, will you marry me and help me bring books to the frontier? Beatrice Gardner, I will marry you and follow you to the ends of the earth, books or no books. He kissed her again, long and deep and full of promise. Though the books do sweeten the deal considerably. They were married 2 weeks later, on the day the traveling library wagon was completed. Mr. Wu had outdone himself, creating something beautiful and functional. The wagon was painted deep blue with gold lettering announcing the Gunnison Traveling Library. Inside, ingenious shelving held hundreds of volumes, secured against rough travel. A small desk folded down from one wall, providing workspace for Beatrice. Storage compartments held supplies, and a reinforced floor could support the weight of multiple readers. The wedding took place in front of the library building, the whole town turning out to witness. Beatrice wore a simple dress of cream muslin, her dark hair adorned with wildflowers that Isaac had picked that morning. Isaac wore a new suit that was only slightly uncomfortable, his hair slicked back, and his expression one of such open joy that several women in attendance dabbed at their eyes. Reverend Matthews kept the ceremony short, understanding that these two were eager to start their adventure. When Isaac kissed his bride, the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed off the mountains. Mrs. Patterson wept openly, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd seen in her 60 years. The celebration lasted well into the evening with food and music and dancing in the street. But eventually, Beatrice and Isaac slipped away, climbing onto the wagon bench as the moon rose over the peaks. "Ready?" Isaac asked, reins in hand. Beatrice looked back at Gunnison, at the people waving goodbye at the building that had housed her dream. Then she looked forward, at the road stretching into darkness, full of possibility. "Ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They traveled the mining camps first, establishing a circuit that took 3 weeks to complete. At each stop, they set up the wagon and opened the sides, transforming it into a mobile reading room. Children swarmed immediately, eager for new stories. Adults browsed more cautiously at first, embarrassed by their limited literacy, but Beatrice had a gift for putting people at ease. Isaac proved invaluable in ways she hadn't anticipated. He was patient with the horses, skilled at finding campsites and negotiating with sometimes hostile locals. But more than that, he connected with the men who might have dismissed a female teacher. He organized reading groups for miners, led discussions about agricultural texts with ranchers, made education feel accessible rather than elitist. At night, they camped under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. They'd build a small fire, share a simple meal, and then Beatrice would read aloud while Isaac mended harness or repaired some part of the wagon that had taken damage during the day's travel. The domesticity of it, the quiet partnership, felt more precious than any grand romance she'd read about in novels. "Read the poetry one," Isaac said one evening, settling back against a log with his coffee. "The one Henderson loves." Beatrice retrieved the worn volume, opening to a familiar page. "She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies," she read, Byron's words flowing smooth and measured. And all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. That's you, Isaac said softly. All that's best of dark and bright. She looked up from the page, meeting his gaze across the firelight. Even after a month of marriage, the intensity of his attention still made her breath catch. You're a romantic, Mr. Thompson. Only for you, Mrs. Thompson. He set down his coffee and moved to sit beside her, pulling her against his side. How'd I get so lucky? I ask myself the same question every day. She closed the book, setting it aside to focus on him. Do you miss it? The freedom of cattle driving, going wherever you wanted. Not even a little. Isaac pressed a kiss to her temple. I've got everything I need right here. You, the books, a purpose worth waking up for. That's more freedom than I ever had riding the range. They fell into silence, comfortable and complete. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered. Isaac. Beatrice's voice was quiet, uncertain. There's something I need to tell you. He tensed slightly, reading the seriousness in her tone. What is it? I think I might be pregnant. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Beatrice held her breath, suddenly afraid. They'd never discussed children, had been so focused on building the library that the future beyond it remained hazy and undefined. Then Isaac's face split into the widest smile she'd ever seen. He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes searching hers. Really? You're sure? Not completely. But the signs are there, and I'm usually regular as clockwork. She covered his hands with hers. I know this complicates things with the traveling and the work. Complicates? Isaac laughed, pulling her into his lap and holding her tight. Beatrice, this is the best news I've ever gotten. A baby, our baby. How could that be anything but wonderful? We'll need to modify the wagon, make space for a cradle, and I won't be able to travel as much in the later months. The practical concerns tumbled out, her teacher's mind already planning and organizing. We'll figure it out. We've figured out everything else, haven't we? He rested his hand on her still flat stomach, his expression one of wonder. A little person, half you and half me, smart and brave and probably too stubborn for their own good. Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes, relief flooding through her. You really want this? I want everything with you. The library, the traveling, babies growing old together, all of it. Isaac kissed her, soft and sweet. You unpacked my heart, Beatrice. Let all the light in after years of darkness. How could I not want to build a family with you? They held each other as the fire burned down to embers, planning and dreaming. They'd need to establish a home base eventually, somewhere Beatrice could safely deliver. Mrs. Patterson had already offered them permanent rooms at the boarding house for whenever they were in Gunnison. They could continue the traveling library on a modified schedule, perhaps taking longer breaks between circuits. What do you think? Isaac asked, his hand still resting protectively on her stomach. Boy or girl? Boy, Beatrice said immediately. With your eyes and your stubborn streak. Girl, Isaac countered. Beautiful and brilliant like her mother, we could compromise and have twins. Beatrice laughed at the look of pure panic that crossed his face. I'm joking. Probably. Maybe. The next months passed in a blur of work and joy and gradual transformation. Beatrice's pregnancy progressed without complication, though she had to modify her activities as her belly swelled. Isaac became absurdly protective, insisting she rest more, lifting anything heavier than a slim volume himself. The mining families and ranch women they visited took her condition as a personal responsibility, showering her with advice and hand-knitted baby clothes. They returned to Gunnison in her 6th month, setting up winter quarters at the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson fussed over Beatrice like a mother hen, insisting she eat more, rest more, put her feet up constantly. Isaac used the time to do major maintenance on the wagon and to build a beautiful cradle from polished pine, carving woodland scenes along the sides. In February of 1884, during a snowstorm that blanketed Gunnison in white silence, Beatrice went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Isaac, pacing the hallway outside their room, thought he might go mad with fear and helplessness. But at dawn, as the storm cleared and sunlight broke through the clouds, a baby's cry pierced the air. Mrs. Patterson emerged, smiling through tears. "You have a son, Mr. Thompson, strong and healthy with a good set of lungs on him." Isaac rushed into the room, his heart nearly stopping at the sight. Beatrice lay exhausted against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in white. She looked up as he entered, and the smile that crossed her face was radiant. "Meet Isaiah," she said softly. "Isaiah Thomas Thompson. I hope you don't mind. I wanted him to carry part of your name." Isaac knelt beside the bed, staring at his son with wonder. The baby was tiny, impossibly perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably change but currently looked gray-green like his father's. When Isaac extended a finger, Isaiah grasped it with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Isaac whispered, awed. "You're perfect. I can't believe we made something this beautiful. We make a good team." Beatrice's voice was tired but happy. "In all things." They spent the rest of the winter in Gunnison, learning to be parents, adjusting to the sleep deprivation and constant demands of an infant. It was exhausting and frustrating and absolutely magical. Isaac discovered he had a talent for soothing a crying baby, walking the floors at night while humming old trail songs. Beatrice managed to raid and nurse simultaneously, determined not to let motherhood completely derail her intellectual pursuits. When spring came and the mountain passes cleared, they were ready to resume their traveling schedule, though on a modified route that kept them closer to town. Isaac had rebuilt the wagon interior, creating a secure sleeping area for Isaiah that protected him from jolts and weather. The mining families welcomed them back with enthusiasm, many of the women eager to see the baby and share their own motherhood stories. Life settled into a new rhythm. They'd travel for 2 weeks, return to Gunnison for 1, maintaining the library services while raising their son. Isaiah grew from infant to toddler against a backdrop of mountain vistas and mining camps, learning to walk on wagon floors and speak his first words surrounded by books. On his 2nd birthday, as they camped near a rushing stream, Isaiah brought his father a book, demanding a story in his imperious toddler way. Isaac settled the boy in his lap and began to read, and Beatrice watched them with a heart so full she thought it might burst. "You were right," she said softly when the story ended and Isaiah had toddled off to play with some smooth stones. "About fighting for what matters, about staying even when it's hard. If I'd left, I would have missed all this." Isaac pulled her close, their son playing within sight, the wagon behind them painted with their dream realized. "If you'd left, I never would have found you, and I'd still be drifting, lost and lonely, thinking freedom meant running away instead of running toward." "We saved each other," Beatrice said. "We did, and we're not done yet." Isaac gestured to the mountains, the vast territory still full of families needing books and education. "We've got miles to go and stories to tell, together." The years rolled by, measured in books circulated and children taught and miles traveled. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Belle who inherited her mother's love of words, and another son, Ian, who was as wild and adventurous as his father. The traveling library became an institution, known throughout the territory. Other communities started their own versions, inspired by the Thompsons' success. When Colorado achieved statehood in 1876, their little operation had already been running for years. They'd begun in 1883, and now it was 1889. The traveling library was now part of the state's educational infrastructure, officially recognized and partially funded by government grants. Beatrice was invited to Denver to advise on library policy, though she never stayed long. The road called to her and Isaac and their growing family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they returned to the spot where they'd first kissed, the boarding house porch in Gunnison. Mrs. Patterson, now well into her 70s but still sharp as a tack, had organized a surprise party. The whole town turned out, along with families from the mining camps and ranches they'd served over the years. Old Mr. Henderson, now ancient but still reciting poetry, stood to offer a toast. 10 years ago, we almost lost something precious. But two people refused to give up, refused to let money and practicality destroy something beautiful. Because of them, hundreds of children can read, families have access to knowledge, and this territory is richer in every way that matters. To Isaac and Beatrice Thompson, who proved that love and books can change the world. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Beatrice found herself crying again, as she had that night 10 years ago when the town had rallied to support her dream. She looked at Isaac, at their 3 children playing nearby, at the life they'd built together, and knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. "Happy anniversary," Isaac murmured, pulling her into his arms for a kiss that was every bit as passionate as their first. "Happy anniversary," she echoed. "Thank you for unpacking my heart and showing me what home really means. Thank you for staying, for fighting, for building this beautiful, impossible life with me." They held each other as the party swirled around them. Two people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment, when both needed saving and both were brave enough to save themselves by saving each other. The traveling library continued for another 15 years, until their children were grown and the territory had developed enough permanent libraries that the mobile service became less critical. By then, they'd logged thousands of miles, touched countless lives, and built a legacy that would outlast them both. They retired to a small house on the outskirts of Gunnison, with a view of the mountains and enough land for a large garden. The wagon was donated to the State Historical Society, where it stood as a testament to pioneer ingenuity and the power of education. But they kept the books, filling their home with the volumes that had started everything. Isaiah followed his parents into education, becoming a teacher in Denver. Belle became a writer, penning novels about frontier life that brought the experiences of ordinary people to wider audiences. Ian, true to his adventurous nature, became an explorer, mapping remote regions of the Rockies, but he always carried books with him, sharing his mother's belief that stories mattered everywhere. In 1910, as the new century rolled forward and the Old West faded into memory, Isaac and Beatrice celebrated their 42nd anniversary in the same house where they'd spent their retirement. Their children and grandchildren gathered, filling the rooms with laughter and love. That evening, after everyone had left, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Isaac's hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes still held that same spark that had caught Beatrice's attention in the library all those years ago. Beatrice's dark hair had silvered, her hands grown arthritic, but she still read voraciously, still saw the world as full of stories waiting to be told. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. "Staying. Building this life instead of taking one of those safe, easy teaching positions back east." Beatrice considered the question seriously, as she always did. Not once, not for a single moment. This life, this wild, unpredictable, sometimes difficult life, has been everything I didn't know I needed. Me too. Isaac raised her hand to his lips, kissing the knuckles gently. You're still the smartest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever met. Still the only one I'd want to travel through life with. Flatterer. But she was smiling, leaning against his shoulder as she had countless times before. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade and the stars emerge. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, carrying the promise of new adventures for a new generation. But Isaac and Beatrice had already had theirs, had lived and loved and built something lasting. "Read to me," Isaac asked softly. "Like you used to on the trail." Beatrice retrieved the old poetry volume, its cover held together now with careful tape, its pages soft from decades of reading. She opened to the Byron poem, the one that had become theirs. "She walks in beauty like the night," she read, her voice still clear despite her years. "Of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes." Isaac listened with closed eyes, his hand never leaving hers, and thought about all the nights they'd spent under those cloudless climes and starry skies. All the miles traveled, the people helped, the love shared. His life before Beatrice seemed like a different person's story, dim and distant. His real life, the one that mattered, had begun the day he'd walked into that library and met a woman packing books to leave. Thank God he'd convinced her to stay. They lived another 5 years, healthy and happy, until one winter morning Isaac simply didn't wake up. He died peacefully in his sleep, with Beatrice beside him, having lived a life richer than he'd ever imagined possible. She followed him 3 months later, unable and unwilling to face a world without her partner, her love, her home. They were buried side by side in the Gunnison cemetery, beneath a simple stone that read, "Isaac and Beatrice Thompson." They brought books and love to the frontier. Together they changed the world. But their real monument was the network of libraries they'd inspired, the readers they'd created, the children who grew up believing education was possible no matter how remote their location. Their legacy lived in every person who checked out a book from that blue and gold wagon, in every life touched by the simple, radical act of bringing stories to people who needed them. Years later, when historians wrote about the settlement of the Western Territories, they mentioned the railroads and the cattle drives, the mines and the homesteaders. Some of them also mentioned a traveling library and the couple who'd run it, noting their contribution to literacy and education in remote areas. But the real story, the one that mattered, wasn't in history books. It was in the journals Beatrice had kept throughout their travels, detailed accounts of their adventures and the people they'd met. Belle published them after her mother's death, and they became bestsellers, inspiring a new generation to believe in the power of books and love, and refusing to give up on dreams. The books told of a young librarian who'd almost run away when things got hard, and a cowboy who'd shown her that staying and fighting was braver than leaving. They told of a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose, of a love that grew deeper with every passing year. They told of 3 children raised between pages and prairie, of a community that rallied to support something beautiful, of 2 people who'd saved each other by being brave enough to stay. It was a story about books, but really it was a story about love. About finding home not in a place but in a person. About the courage it takes to unpack your heart and let someone in, knowing they might hurt you but trusting them not to. About building a life that matters, one day and one choice at a time. And it all started because a cowboy walked into a library and saw a woman packing books to leave. He unpacked her heart instead, and together they created something neither could have built alone. They stayed, they fought, they loved, and they won. That was the real story. And it was better than any fiction Beatrice had ever read.